that this sublimation is, for example, somebody may throw themselves into work or into sport, into physical activity. In some ways, this is seen as Freud as a controlled release of maybe aggressive tendencies or sexual urges or whatever. So sublimation is, even Freud will agree, a mild release, and maybe not what the dominant part of the personality, the id, requires. Perhaps move on to the third part, the superego. This is something that develops with socialization. It's not part of the child when they are born. It is the parent figure, the preacher, or the policeman inside your head.
So, for example, in toilet training, the id would just not even know it was urinating. The ego has a sense, I'd better urinate in a toilet, because if I don't, the superego will come and punish me for doing that. It is in fact a crime for a grown-up to urinate in the street, for instance.
Exactly. The interesting thing about the superego is you would ask, how does the superego punish? It punishes through guilt. And this is why Freud argues that the superego is incompatible with religion, that religion fits with the superego, that civilization and religion is like a superstructure, a collective superego, so that what the superego does is give incredibly, impossibly high standards for you to live up to, and then when you fail in this, then it punishes the ego with guilt, massive amounts of guilt. So the ego, in Freudian terms, is constantly besieged and embattled from not just the id, not just the superego, but also reality, because it has to deal with the reality of being a human being.
I think you explained that the ultimate reality that the ego fears more than anything else. It's a fearful world, isn't it? I mean, in Freud thinks that the best you can get out of life really is to be what he calls ordinarily unhappy, just to be constantly disappointed, constantly feeling pain and so forth. And what his clinical therapy was supposed to address was very serious unhappiness, neurosis, people who simply couldn't get out of bed in the morning because they were so fearful of everything. So the thing that's feared most of all is dissolution of the ego, death, isn't it? And the impossible task that the superego is addressing is the avoidance of death. I mean, that is completely impossible. But in some, going back to religion, the appeal of religion in Freudian terms is it appears to be a way the ego can defeat death by having an afterlife which is promised by religion. Is that?
But Freud is scathing of this. I mean, he thinks it's a very effective sublimation, but ultimately he thinks that that's all it is. It is a sublimation. It is a sop, really, for these needs. Freud sees the world as pain. He sees, in general terms, he sees it in three types of sort of pain that we must experience as human beings. One is just physical, everyday pain of us, our bodies decaying, of being subject to disease, and so on. This is something that he knew personally from his. He had cancer of the mouth, which was incredibly painful. He lived with this pain every day. Second thing is just life, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, the things that just make life very, very difficult. And then the third thing, and this is the worst type of pain. This is excruciating. This is the one thing that Freud says makes it impossible to have any sort of happiness in your life, and that is other people. Other people make this world hellish, because coming into interaction with other people means that we must deal with this loaded situation. We must address our needs, and we must face somebody who has needs themselves. And this, we may feel aggressive towards them. We may feel sexual urges towards them. And then so it is all about needs unfulfilled.
I'm thinking, am I right in thinking that the main people who make people's lives hell are close relatives, especially siblings and their parents? And so one of the most famous bits of Freudian psychoanalytical thinking is the Oedipus complex. So we'd better deal with that since we're doing Freud. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Oedipus complex is almost a cliche at this stage. This is the idea, and almost everybody knows this. Even people who've vaguely heard of Freud have heard of the Oedipus complex. This is essentially what it means: is that you want to sleep with your mother and murder your father. It's very influential in literature, in the arts. Typically, it's been used to analyze pieces of literature such as Hamlet. Hamlet, the Oedipus complex is seen in Hamlet. There's the famous scene of him in his mother's bedroom where they physically touch, and Freud said that this is classical sort of behavior of a son with his mother. I mean, it's in the trade, in the psychiatric trade. I mean, it's dismissed. Really, people think it is just sort of fantasy, but in literature, it has had a huge effect.
I think that's right. I mean, just this week, the big movie that's been released is We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is exactly a Freudian sort of casebook, really, of a child that is just endlessly cruel and monstrous towards his mother in order to punish her for not giving him enough attention, really. But on one simple level, I mean, this is quite commonsensical, isn't it? That children who are neglected by their parents are going to turn out to be unhappy people. I mean, on one level, it just seems very commonsensical. And that's part of the critique, is it not, of Freud's method of psychoanalysis, that it's essentially pseudoscience, starting with the problem that who psychoanalyzes a psychoanalyst, which is something they tried to solve but found it was an infinite regress. So there were certain types of people who couldn't psychoanalyze other people and so forth. Then to the very limited clinical success of this. I mean, people who are unhappy, have psychoanalysis, remain unhappy even after a decade of the treatment. So what kind of treatment is that? But I believe there are other intellectual and clinical critiques of Freud which you dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should just say what the analysis is. I mean, it is one of those things where you sort of take it for granted because we've all seen the movies. We've seen
Talking Cure. Everyone's heard of that. The Talking Cure.
Yeah.
And the analysis of dreams.
Yeah, because Freud, he said that he had access. He had discovered this country and this id, and he had found access to it. And what the access was through free association. Your analyst, your therapist will talk to you, and through long conversations, your id will find a way to come to the surface and say things that the therapist, as an expert, will be able to interpret and then be able to address these issues. For Freud, the key thing though was not free association, was dreams. He described the dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, and then he thought that through the interpretation of dreams, then you could get access to the unconscious, to the id. But as you say, people who were looking at his work and his the clinical evidence that he gave for his ideas, people say that he's just made up. He's just a charlatan. Some of the examples, the cases that he uses, some of them didn't exist, and some of them have been fabricated. And people, the Freudian technique has been found to be not very effective.
Well, as ever, time is running against us, but in the lecture you dealt with the political impact as well, and you put the proposition that Freud really was a man looking back to the 19th century, very sexually repressed, to use one of his own terms, where sex was a problem. It was a pathological problem, how to keep sex in its place and keep that monster inside. But some of his followers took a very different view. I think you told us that in lecture. What was that?
I mean, we only have the most brief time to mention him, but I think it is, in the context of Freud, worth mentioning Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich was a follower of Freud, but then broke away from him because he didn't agree with the pessimistic view that Freud took on the personality, and in particular the role of sexuality. He thought the sexuality was a beneficial thing, that essentially was the best expression of ourselves, and far from repressing it, it was the free expression of sex and your sexuality would be beneficial to you as a personality and beneficial to society as a whole. So again, it was everything that Freud said, not repression, release this. And this, his phrase was, there is a policeman inside your head, he must be destroyed. This fitted in very well into the 1960s counterculture. But
If it feels good, do it. That was one of their slogans, wasn't it?
Exactly, and he was very influential, very, very interesting, but I think we're running out of time.
Okay, so on that note, we'll have to wrap it up. Brian, thanks very much for that quick canter through Sigmund Freud. We'll be back next week to canter through something else.